Hello and welcome to Mandibil. This is my second Ask Me Anything, and honestly, there wasn't that many questions asked on the what's it called, member stream page of YouTube, and I'm not really accustomed to or used to using this format, writing messages on YouTube, and I don't think that my subscribers are actually particularly aware of it. And also, it might just, when you see it once and might think, I might get back to that, then it's sort of hidden way back in your YouTube feed, so you're not going back there. So it, unless you write a question in that feed immediately, I think it might, it's said, oh, it's too bothersome to try to go back and find it and whatever, right? So maybe in the future I will put it on only on the board, and then keep reminding you to, if there's, if you want to do some Ask Me Anything, please go to the board and so on, right? So maybe that, man. Give me a comment. How do you think it would be best to do it? The best way to do it, if you want. I mean, those, it's not like it has to be a majority vote. If most people don't want a Ask Me Anything, it's not like the rest of the people have to be downvoted. If there are three people wanting to ask questions, well, fine, let me take those three questions and might, engage the other people, right? And so on and so on and so on. So, but I've done it differently, or actually not differently, but I have done it in this particular fashion, where if there's a question in some of my videos in the YouTube comment section that I either don't sufficiently answer or think that needs some elaboration, or it's such an important question that I need to do it more in this fashion rather than the text, flyby text comment I might make on YouTube, then I might take it up here as a question in an Ask Me Anything. I mean, if it's a question, it's sort of a question that is maybe even more focused than just trying to come up with a question that is sort of out of the blue, rather than there's a context where the question arrives in. So I picked out a few questions also from the comment sections of my videos, right? But okay, I haven't prepared too much for this. First of all, I don't really have the time or the yeah, time and money. Time is money, right? To go into some kind of deep kind of preparations, anything like that, right? So I take it on the fly as I usually do, right? Some questions are larger, some than some other questions maybe, and so they might have benefited from me maybe taking some more time to dive into it, but I don't want it to be some kind of also feeling that if I ask a question, I will make a half-hour dissertation of some kind. That then it sort of loses its Ask Me Anything. It's sort of a loose kind of thing, right? So it's not like it's not serious, but it's not like a 5 hour dissertation, philosophical dissertation of any kind, right? So that's not how I want it to be. I want it to be something like this in the now, you could say, right? Okay, Robert Roest, a recent member, and thank you for joining, asked me in the Ask Me Anything list on YouTube, three questions, which is sort of wrapped, or one question that is wrapped into three questions, right? And they are: what do you think is mind? What do you think is brain? How, if so, do the two relate to each other? Now, this is, the question of the ages, right? The mind and matter problem, right? Um, the mind and matter problem can also be formulated as the hard problem of consciousness. Or when you have the dualist approach, which is usually as also called materialism, where you think of what is reality is, you could say, matter, and then at some point this matter gives you awareness, or gives you consciousness, or gives you mind, or whatever term you want to put on it, right? Not realizing the inherent foundational problem, which is the paradox I keep coming back to in my presentations, and which I have why I usually call myself an idealist, though I have retracted a bit on that recently, realizing that I'm actually not an idealist. I just had an uninformed idea of what it means to be an idealist. So I don't really know what kind of label to put on my philosophy. And it's not like I want or need a label to put on it, right? But in some cases it would be easier just to be able to say I'm this kind of thing, in order to make it. There's my power cable here, there's some connectivity problem. I don't know. Okay, I hope it doesn't. I hope it keeps still. Never mind. So what do you think is mind and what do you think is brain is actually presupposing something here. It is presupposing a dualist metaphysics. So what you have to go back to is, how deep can you go into the foundations of your thinking, right? And I think a point that is as good as any is Descartes' "I think, therefore I am," right? Now, I'm not this, I think I am. It's not particularly well formulated, maybe, not in sort of modern kind of approaches, right? Because what is that I, and so on? Why is it an am? Is it a being? So it's sort of, okay, we can, discuss it's a translation from, Latin and so on, right? But there is an experience and there's an awareness of that experience, right? And Descartes basically says, because there's an awareness, there's also a being that is aware. So it's sort of entailed in the description of the cogito ergo sum, or the think therefore I am, right? So if I should try to find that lowest level, it is, there's an experience, there are colors, there are sounds, and so on, right? And there's an awareness of the experience, right? And how that awareness is being aware is sort of maybe hard to clarify. But one way to do it is to say the awareness is that which cognizes aspects of the experience, right? If I'm sitting here, if I should just be neutral about it, it would be sounds and colors and tastes. I'm not really tasting much other than my breakfast or my lunch not too long ago. I can still sort of taste it, right? There are sounds and feeling temperature, whatever, not temperature, but heat and cold and whatever, right? These kinds of, this flurry of qualia, that's the experience. Now, the awareness of the experience is that the awareness says, that's a shelf, that's a laptop, right? That's a lamp, that's a carpet, and so on. The carpet doesn't arrive through your experiences. It's the inside of your awareness or your I or your me that cognizes certain aspects, or sort of labels, you could say, the whole experience. So it's sort of more useful for the mind. So if it sort of is saber-toothed tiger, there's some emotional thing that follows from that, right? So that there's a feedback, from the experience in order to move your body around and so on, right? Okay. So from that base, that there is no mind as such, right? Mind is a label you have put on your experience, just like the elephant or the carpet or the lamp, right? And it's even more abstract than lamp, because you are not cognizing mind. Where would you look in order to... you can't experience mind, right? Where is it? It's an artificial category. or it's an artificial label that, in my opinion, is sort of a encompassing, or a big bag of everything that is going on in this particular awareness of yours, right? All the aspects of it, the experience, the awareness, the cognition, the scientific method, the ideas, the philosophy, everything that you can possibly tap into, you could say, within this awareness, right? And what you're aware of is also the experiences, right? The qualia. And when you analyze those qualia, it starts to look like there's something sort of, let's say, outside thing, right? But that's one of the things I've been criticizing Bernardo Castro for recently, which is this: of course there is an outside. Well, when you sit down, in my opinion, and try to pinpoint within that experience of yours, right, that there is an outside. What is it about those colors, those sounds, and so on? It might be that your mind says, this is an outside, this is an outside, this is an outside, but that's coming from the inside of that experience, right? There's nothing about that which is the pure experience, which must be the closest thing to whatever might potentially be beyond the experience, if you start to think about there's something beyond my experiences, right? So what is it about those colors and sounds and so on? Because that's all you have access to from the first ground floor, right? If you might, say, okay, I'm experiencing elephant, I'm experiencing stereo, I'm experiencing my carpet and, my bookshelf, whatever, right? These are cognitions placed on your experience from the inside. Placing something from the inside does not give you and of course there is an outside, right? All I can end up with in that kind of thinking is, if you need to say there is an outside, you can only do it by axiom. You can only go and say, I am deciding, because I can't reason my way to it, that there is an outside, and potentially, and the why I want to do it is because I am treating these experiences and cognitions as a representation of something outside, right? It's just habitual to think of it when you're a child and you grow up, and so on. Parents when they say something, they're not in your mind, so to say, they're outside your mind. Otherwise it would sort of be crazy, right? So when you do it this way, which is the right way of thinking, in my opinion, which is also this axiom-based kind of thinking, which is, I have to do the thinking myself, right? When you talk about mind, you're actually referring to something you do not experience. It's purely an abstraction. So I can't say what it is, other than it's an abstraction, right? What do you think is brain? I don't think it... I could maybe come up with an idea of what it is, but what it is not the same as my experience of it, right? If I'm saying my mind is inside my brain, right, then whatever I'm experiencing is outside my experience. Otherwise, it would be the same thing, and I wouldn't have to delineate between brain and mind, right? So if we say mind is all that which goes on, the experiences and all that I talked about before, and then brain is somewhere, mind is somehow enclosed within that brain, then brain is outside your mind. And that creates that paradox I'm talking about. If you say that some part of your experience is your brain, if I were to drill a little hole in my skull and you put a mirror up, I could say, yeah, that's my brain, right? I wouldn't do that. Don't do this at home, please. Right? Don't listen, but only listen, don't do, right? Okay. I might be able to, without screwing too much with my brain and my experience, in order to actually experience my own brain, you could say, right? A hole in my forehead, don't do it at home, please. Please listen carefully, right? But it's a thought experiment. I would be able to possibly, I haven't experienced my own brain, and I don't think anybody has, right? Very few people at least. But you can experience somebody that looks like you that seems to have a brain, or you have experienced that brain or an animal brain, and say, okay, by reasoning, you can get, there's very likely there is a brain in here. But actually, very few people have experienced their own brain, right? So how do you know there's a brain? You don't know that because you haven't experienced it, right? But if you say there is a brain, then if you are experiencing brain, that experience is in your mind, right? Otherwise, you are violating the whole system you just set up if you're working from that axiom I talked about before. And that's why you need to be very careful about stating these axioms so you don't screw around when you start to talk about these aspects later, because then you're just blurring the lines, just like Bernardo Kastrup does, right? Because then you should be very careful not to violate that axiom, system, and delineations you have already set up in order to get to talk about that outside, right? So when you talk about brain, it must be an experience inside your mind. Well, then it's not your brain if you're saying your brain is outside your mind, right? It can only be, as the axiom I stated pointed out, that what you call brain is a representation in your mind of something outside you do not have access to, that which you call brain, right? It doesn't become that which you experience just because you do not have anything else. Because you have established by axiom, as I said earlier, these are representations, right? So it's all going on in mind, you could say. But you are working from an axiom that says, I'm treating this as if it's an outside, right? You could go into discussions, why do I need to establish as an outside? But you don't have to, right? You can stay solipsist all you want. It's just like, to the best of my understanding of how I am built and how my urges are, I need to manifest some actions that is not a part of my mind, but some of these representations that I call my body, my hands, and my speaking apparatus and so on, all seems to try to do something outside my mind, you could say, right? So I'm working implicitly as if there's an outside of my mind, even though if there's an outside, I do not have direct access to it. I only had that inner experiential representation. And that is good enough, right? That is good enough. And to get to get to the last question, how, if so, do they relate to each other? Well, I don't know if they relate actually, right? I mean, how do they relate? They don't relate necessarily, other than maybe you could say it makes sense to say that mind is my idea of mind is encompassed by brain. But I don't know that. How could I know? Because I don't have direct access to brain. And mind is just a label I've put on it, right? So it's you have to be fucking careful with this, because in these foundational bits, it's so easy to take one step in the wrong direction. You could say wrong direction, right? And then the rest of your philosophy is basically screwed, right? So I hope this makes some kind of sense. I think it is difficult to, unless you understand the paradox keep referring to, which is this saying that there's an outside and then thinking that that outside is the actual experience you're having, while at the same time you are basically working from an axiom that says, I only have access to my mind mental experiences, right? It can't be both. It can't both be out there and in there at the same time. That doesn't work for me, at least. And this seems to be even Bernardo Kastrup. He violates this by saying, of course there's an outside. He doesn't have to argue for it. And he says, it's mind. Of course it's mind. Because then he don't have to bring in some other stuff, right? So, and I have been very critical of that lately, because it suddenly dawned on me what it is that I keep cropping up. Why I have keep coming back to his videos. There's something, there's a problem in his philosophy, and I haven't identified what it is, right? And the problem is, mind cannot be a reduction base, right? It's impossible, as I pointed out in my recent video called, I think I called it Analytic Idealism is Baloney, right? Or Bernardo Castro and Analytic Idealism is Baloney. It's a pun on one of his books called Materialism is Baloney, right? So I'm just, playing around with the words, you could say, right? Okay. I hope that makes sense, Robert Roest. Give me your comment and let me know if that settles things for you, and or maybe keep it in mind for Ask Me Anything part 3, right, in the future. Okay. From the YouTube comments, Mr. B. Watson, who came in around the Analytic Idealism is Baloney video, and asked questions, and then sort of, it seemed to me, figured out that I'm actually not, as stupid as you might think. I could actually argue, and I'm not interested in particularly in being, what is it? Shouting at people. I get carried away a bit sometimes. I get a bit triggered and emotional when these philosophers, they screw around with you, right? That pisses me off, and I'm sometimes I would like to be sort of, I could be more balanced in my approach, more cool and calm and collected, you could say. But on the other hand, right, if I'm artificially cool, calm, and collected, I would also sound like a sophist, right? It's only sophists who are very cool and calm and collected about screwed up philosophers, right? Those who are actually interested and feel it deeply, the problems about philosophy, they're very passionate about it, I would think, right? And I count myself among them. I'm not going to... So, it's just a side note, right? Okay. But anyway, he came in and started asking questions, and good for you, man, right? Mr. B. Watson. And I noticed that later you subbed on my channel, so thank you very much. Welcome aboard, and I hope you enjoy your stay. I pulled this question, which is part of a longer discussion on the comments, right? How do we know we are defining something correctly? The word exist. How do we know we have defined it correctly? I mean, what if we call existence? What if what we call existence is actually non-existent? How would we know? Well, I gave an answer here. I'm going to represent my answer, and then I'm going to elaborate on it, right? Okay, I answered. A definition is not knowledge, but to be strict, in my opinion, right? Okay, I'm slightly going off topic here without realizing. I'm red herring him, and I'm sorry for that. But what I was trying to get at is we can't know about a definition. All knowledge is based on definitions and philosophy, right? The arrival at knowledge is based on a series of axioms and definitions before you can talk about knowledge. So I know that language is kind of weak in order to deal with these kinds of discussions, metaphysics. Language is made for physics, not for metaphysics, you could say, right? So I'm fine. I'm just pointing it out about knowledge, right? It is based on the structure of your philosophy. So what I'm trying to get at is you have to be your own philosopher. You can't define something that somebody else came up with, right? If somebody comes to say, hey, existence, define it. I didn't come up with the term existence, right? I might want to use it, and I'm doing my philosophy and say, the word existence fits with this kind of philosophy I'm doing, and this definitions and this axiom and so on. Okay, fine, right? But it's not like somebody's handing out terms that you have to go around and define, right? It's this kind of collective idea of philosophy, which is stupid, in my opinion. Philosophy is a very, very, very individual endeavor. Anybody appealing to some kind of collective that we are thinking like this, and we should be doing this, and we this, and we that, right? They are actually completely misunderstanding what philosophy is actually about. It is about you thinking about your experience, right? It's about you getting to terms with it, right? or getting to the terms, you could say, right? If you want to use the term exist, it's up to you to find out, right? Now, if you have done some philosophy and you may start a channel like I've done, and you're listening to somebody else or deconstructing it or commenting on it, you might want to ask them, what do you mean by that term you're using, right? That's a particular chapter where you're asking somebody who's already using a term in their philosophy, what do you actually mean by that term? That's not the question per se that I hear Mr. B. Watson asking. It's basically, how do we know we're defining something correctly? Well, you can't know it. And what would you mean by a correct definition? That would be something that it presupposes that is already settled in order for you to define something. And that's why it's a very, very good exercise to ask philosophers for definitions. Because you will very quickly find out that they're not really on board with what the hell they're saying. They're just throwing around terms in the hope that you already have an understanding what that term means, and then they build on that term with a new term, and then yet another term, and yet another term, and then it's a series of terms that is completely lost in definition, right? And then you're sort of usually or likely going to say, I guess it's because this Bernardo Kastrup or whoever, he has a PhD, is so smart, he's the best thing since sliced philosophy, right? He's the new man. He knows everything. I just have to bow down and accept his definition, something like that, right? Don't do that. That's why I will always be appealing to, you have to do the philosophy by yourself. You have to come up with the definitions. And what are those definitions based on? They are based on this ground floor kind of thinking where you sort of wind back in a Cartesian fashion, or Descartes, I think therefore I am kind of thinking, right? This doubtful thinking. How can I know about that? Okay, off it goes if I can't point out how did I get to that. So it's the idea that there is something that your philosophy, this particular part of your philosophy, has to be based on. What is it based on? It's based on some kind of definitions of the terms used in that philosophy. Okay, if I look at those terms, how are they defined? So you're getting a step back there, right? Okay, if you look at those terms used to define this one, those terms also have to be defined, and so on. A regression back to some foundation. That might as well be, I think, therefore I am, right? Or something along those solipsist lines. And then you say, okay, I can't go any deeper than that, otherwise it just sort of poof, disappears and there's nothing, right? So when you just before you go into poof, everything disappears, right? That's where your reduction base is. That's why the reduction idea is good philosophically, because it points out that when people are talking about some particular aspect of philosophy or their philosophy, you have to be able to trace it back to that reduction base. Otherwise, they might just as well be sitting there spewing whatever they want to spew. And they are very likely connecting the dots in the way they want to connect them to get to the conclusions they want to get to. That's not good philosophy. Good philosophy is getting to that reduction base and step by step by step work ahead to your goal, right? Without leaving anything undefinable or not definable in a way that is very clearly, directly related back to that reduction base, right? So the answer is basically, you are the one who knows whether or not you are defined correctly. If you choose to present your philosophy to some extent like I do, right? Or in a way that I do to some extent, then I might challenge your definitions and try to figure out how you do this, right? In order to figure out whether or not you're actually doing something that is functional. And I would like people to do the same thing with what I'm saying, right? Now, it might not be, if you're talking about epistemology or knowledge, and then I give you a definition of knowledge, that might not make any sense unless you have the whole series of my axioms and definitions and so on, right? So it might very quickly become sort of abstract, you could say, right? So then you would need some kind of treatise that my philosophy is based on. And that's why I'm doing this kind of book I'm writing, right? I've been lazy about writing this book. I have to admit, I would like to get going with it before I sort of lose contact with it, right? But there's just this big hurdle I have to get over, and it's like, it's going to be a big hurdle, right? It's this think part of cogito, right, of Descartes, the thinking, or the, I don't know, it's what goes on behind, inside your experience, on the inside of your mind, right? All that goes on there, I have to describe it in a way to make sure that people don't think I'm trying to screw with them. I might not need all parts of it, but I need to lay out the map so they understand absolutely where I'm coming from, so that they don't feel I'm just picking something out of my asshole, right? Yeah, I think I got a little carried away here. Let's get back on track, right? How would we know? Is it defined correctly? It's up to you to figure out whether or not it's defined correctly. And if you choose to present your philosophy, there might be somebody else who wants to check whether or not it's defined correctly. And how is it correct? Well, it's based on the rest of your philosophy before that particular part you want to define, right? So it's all based on your philosophy. You can't claim that people should define their philosophy or terms in their philosophy differently just because you have an idea how it should be because that's based on your philosophy or some third-party philosophy nobody cares about, maybe, right? So philosophy is personal, and therefore you know if their definitions are good. And because I feel that people tend to, in some instances at least, they have an agenda they want their philosophy to follow, and then they're screwing around with their own philosophy, pretending that it's good philosophy, but they are just steering the ship in the direction they want to go. So they are sort of screwing around with the terms and screwing around with the philosophy in order to bend it towards the direction they want to go, rather than the strict road it has to follow if there are good definitions, right? So that's why I'm deconstructing philosophy in order to figure out how are people screwing around with this philosophy in order to get to their preconceived conclusions, which is usually what is going on, right? Okay. To get back to my answer on YouTube, in my opinion, a definition has to be easily traceable back to the foundations, quote, reduction base of your philosophy. Furthermore, in my opinion, my reduction base has to be something I can directly experience without asking anybody else for clarification. That is actually a good point. I'm glad I mentioned this, and I noted this also here. It has to be your philosophy, right? If it's your experience, your mind, and so on, it must be your philosophy. You can't drag in philosophy in order to describe your experience, because it's not there. From the starting point, I think, therefore I am, there's nobody else there, right? So the starting point is there's nobody else yet in my philosophy. So I can't just bring it in from the left and say, okay, Descartes said, or Immanuel Kant said, or Bernardo Kastrup said. I have to leave that alone before I define what a Bernardo Kastrup is, right? And I need to do all my metaphysics and even knowledge maybe in order to establish that there's something called Bernardo Kastrup. And then I can't wind back and say, okay, now I got to Bernardo Kastrup, I'm winding back, and now I'm screwing around with my metaphysics. No. That is cut in stone now, because you needed to cut it in stone in order to get to Bernardo Kastrup. You see? These kinds of leaps in philosophy are so common you won't believe it, right? Look for it. Okay. In my opinion, a lot of what is considered reasoned philosophy actually needs to be axiomized or defined. It is completely up to you to settle on your own philosophy. That is when it gets really tough, because when you come up with it, it has to be ultimately what leads you to what you mean by knowledge and a moral principle, right? So it all hangs on yourself. You can't lease it out to somebody else to figure out how to get to a moral principle or what it means to know something and all these things. You have to come up with it yourself. And if we have to work together, we have to agree upon it, right? I have my philosophy, you have your philosophy. Let's compare our definitions and actions and see if we agree about what is going on. If we do not agree, it might not be a good idea to work together, right? That's the kind of thinking I would like to work towards. The easy way out is to just adopt someone else's philosophy without enough scrutiny and potentially ending up in confirmation bias. Yeah, so it says basically what I've said so far, right? Okay, I hope that is a good answer to your prior question, Mr. B. Watson. So the next one is from Ryan H. And I think it seemed like an out of place comment, but I think it's a comment in one video, but it's referring to another video. So it's possibly a Molyneux video deconstruction or debunking critical video I've done where he's referring to. And he says, why would recording a video whilst you sleep not be obvious evidence of a world/reality outside of your own subjective conscious experience? Well, what you're referring to is a subjective conscious experience, right? Recording is an interpretation, right? That recording doesn't have a color, it doesn't have a sound, and so on, right? Recording might be referring to some aspect that is recording sound, but recording is an interpretation. That is not a sound itself, right? Me saying the word recording is not recording. That's the sound of a reference, a linguistic appeal to something else, right? So this thing that you're saying, it's like saying something like this, and maybe that is not a sufficient way of dealing with the question, maybe, right? But it's like, okay, I have this experience here. I think it's very subjective, without getting into further description of what you mean by subjective, but something, subjective conscious experience, right? Then I'm using my conscious experience, taking this object X, and I'm putting it here. And when I keep looking at that object X, that subjective conscious experience is all of a sudden an objective description of that which it was placed in front of, and proving that that is outside my experience. You see, it's completely ridiculous, right? And this is one of these loops of contradiction you end up in if you have a materialist approach to metaphysics, right? So please, you have to go back and maybe in this, ask me anything to understand what I've said from the first question by Robert Roest, the first question starting about 5 minutes into this video, and to try to understand what I mean by this paradox, that you're saying that my experiences is both inside my, subjective conscious experience, and it's at the same time also outside my experience. How do you get to that? How can you experience, if you're not saying it explicitly, but it's implicit in the way you formulate your question? Why would it not be obvious? There's nothing that is obvious. But what is okay now? I have a color over there. That's obvious. What does that mean that color is obvious? A sound, a taste? Why is it obvious? What does it mean that it's obvious? No experience is arriving with any kind of explanation. That's why it's personal. You have to come up with your own explanations. If you want to call it an explanation, right? You have to come up with a philosophy of your own. You can't. This guy said that when you use this object X and you put it there, all the world is explained. Give me a fucking break, man. It doesn't work. Because you're using your subjective experiences in order to rearrange the world in this particular, or your experience in this particular fashion. And then all of a sudden, by pure magic, this outside world arrives to you fully formed and directly accessible. That's ridiculous, right? Okay. Then the last questions this time around is from magicsinglez, ending on a C. You just want to expose. Oh, it's a comment to my recent Stefan Molyneux critique video, right? You just want to expose STEM. I think he means Stef. STEM's contradictions, or do you oppose libertarianism or the racism that Stef turned to, or are you just afraid of the mob? This is where your disdain stems from. You expect other people to knuckle under the same way you did? Are you simply casting aspersions on someone else? It's fun naming someone else as a witch. So this is sort of, I get some weird vibes from magicsinglez here, right? It's also a straw man argument, right? You are arguing against this, therefore you must have this philosophy. It's sort of, no, it doesn't follow. Just because I'm critical of something, right? Just because I'm asking for some definitions or criticizing some other people's definitions, or, philosophy, doesn't mean that I must therefore have a particular kind of philosophy or particular kinds of incentives and so on, right? Yes, I'm fine with you, anybody, trying to come up with an explanation of my intentions or whoever intentions, right? That's what I call the worst case principle. That you're trying to come up with what could possibly be the incentive, and when you think about it, you might want to consider what could be the worst incentive they have in regards to the consequences for me, right? That's the thinking I would like people to have, rather than saying, "Oh, my prime minister said I had to take an injection, so of course I'm going to do it," right? Because they couldn't possibly have any agenda of any kind. They're just out to save me, right? This lack of critical thinking is a huge problem, right? It's basically the individual kind of thinking. I want to appeal to as much to individualism as I can possibly get away with, right? Don't take anything for given. Don't take anything for granted. Be critical of everything. Be critical of me, please. Please be critical. Debunk all my videos. Deconstruct all my videos. Please do it, man, right? I would love it. I would love it. I would, revel in, be entertained, possibly, right? It's about being critical of what somebody tells you, because what somebody tells you is your particular individual interpretation of a sound or a color and so on. How did you get to that interpretation? Did you do the philosophy, right? Did you? Or are you just working from some implanted ideas of how things should be understood? That's what you want to get to. You need to realize, in my opinion, the only one who can save me, the only one who can do it, is me. I have to do the philosophy. I can't take anything for granted, right? I can be inspired and, and deconstruct other people's video in order to clarify my own. Yeah, fine. But at the end of the day, it's your decision. You are deciding on your metaphysics, your definitions, your axioms, and so on. Ultimately, you have to arrive at a moral principle, in my opinion. Because even people who do not, most people in the world haven't, who has arrived at a moral principle that is functional? I don't know. I haven't heard about anyone, right? Somebody have alluded to it, but when you scrutinize and think about it, it doesn't really work, right? Please enlighten me if somebody has come up with something that seems to work. I would like to know, right? Certainly, absolutely, surely, Stefan Molyneux hasn't done it. He hasn't even got close to it. He doesn't even know that he hasn't done it, right? And what he has done is not the moral principle. So it's like it's screwball comedy, right? What he's doing. So I am not trying to do anything. I am interested, and I guess you will have to believe me. Don't believe me. Don't want to believe me. I am interested in getting to the core of philosophy in order to get to the best version of my own philosophy that I possibly can, right? And by doing these deconstructions, first of all, I'm doing a bit of work for you, right? And you might like it, you might not like it. Fine. I mean, I'm doing it for free. Don't blame me, right? That you don't like it. You don't have to watch it, right? And but at the end of the day, I want to be inspired in order to get to the best version of my, and I also want to find people or clarify people who are not good at it. So I know what not to do, basically, right? And I can warn other people of this. I don't think this is a good way to do it, right? And then I sprinkle a bit of my own philosophy into it to illuminate that I might actually have something to go with myself, right? So, yes, I think this is it. I hope you like the comments and the answers to Ask Me Anything. And please go to the board and ask questions there if you want part 3 or the next part and the next Ask Me Anything within, let's say, a month or so. And let's see how it goes. Otherwise, please share and like and subscribe and consider a donation. Links below, and also links to crypto donation on my board. And otherwise, have a nice day. See you in the next one.